It was dawn. A thin man with glasses, calm and composed, was led barefoot to the center of a concentration camp. German soldiers forced him to strip naked. A Nazi doctor watched. And then, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was slowly hanged with wire, like a common criminal, for defying Adolf Hitler until his final breath. But who was this man? And why did his faith threaten the most powerful regime in history? This is the story of a German Lutheran pastor who chose death over silence. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't just any preacher. He was a brilliant theologian, author of books like The Cost of Discipleship, and one of the most dangerous men in Nazi Germany. While other church leaders bowed to Hitler, Bonhoeffer stood firm. He called the worship of the Führer what it was: idolatry. He founded the Confessing Church, an underground Christian resistance movement that refused to compromise with evil. But Bonhoeffer would go far beyond preaching. He would cross a line that would seal his fate forever. In 1933, when Hitler rose to power, most German pastors took an oath of loyalty to the Führer. Bonhoeffer refused. While synagogues burned and Jewish businesses were destroyed, he preached that Christians had a duty to protect the persecuted. The Gestapo began watching him. His phone was tapped. His mail was intercepted. But Bonhoeffer didn't retreat into silence. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He joined a conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Operation Valkyrie, a plot that would either save Germany or destroy everyone involved. For a man of God, this created an impossible moral dilemma. How could a pastor plan murder? Bonhoeffer wrestled with this question, but ultimately concluded, when a madman drives a car onto the sidewalk, the pastor cannot simply bury the dead. He must try to wrench the steering wheel from the madman's hands. The conspiracy involved high-ranking German officers who had grown disgusted with Hitler's war crimes. Bonhoeffer served as a courier, using his church connections to communicate with Allied forces. But the Gestapo was closing in. On April 1943, the knock came at dawn. Gestapo agents arrested Bonhoeffer at his parents' home in Berlin. His sister Maria watched in horror as they led him away in handcuffs. For 2 years, Bonhoeffer was shuffled between prisons, first Tegel in Berlin, then Gestapo headquarters, then Buchenwald concentration camp, and finally Flossenburg. But something extraordinary happened in those dark cells. Instead of breaking, Bonhoeffer became a source of light for fellow prisoners. He conducted worship services in secret, he taught, comforted the dying. He shared his meager rations with others. Even the guards began to respect him. One later wrote, "He was so completely surrendered to God that he seemed to have overcome the fear of death." During his imprisonment, Bonhoeffer wrote letters that would later become some of the most powerful Christian literature ever produced. His letters and papers from prison revealed a man wrestling with faith in the face of absolute darkness. He wrote to his fiancée, Maria, "I believe that God will give us all the strength we need to help us to resist in all time of distress. But he never gives it in advance, lest we should rely on ourselves and not on him alone." The war was turning against Germany. Allied forces were advancing from all sides. If Bonhoeffer could just survive a few more months, he might be liberated. But Hitler had other plans. In late 1944, the Gestapo discovered documents that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy against Hitler. Names, dates, plans, everything was exposed. The Nazi leadership realized that Bonhoeffer wasn't just a troublesome pastor, he was a key player in a plot to kill the Führer. Hitler personally ordered that all conspirators be eliminated before the Allies could liberate them and turn them into martyrs for the resistance. Bonhoeffer was moved to Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria. This wasn't a place for political prisoners. This was a death camp. On April 8, 1945, Bonhoeffer was conducting a worship service for fellow prisoners when 2 guards burst in. "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, get ready and come with us." Everyone in that room knew what those words meant. It was a death sentence. As Bonhoeffer was led away, he turned to his friend Payne Best, a British intelligence officer, and said, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." Dawn, April 9, 1945. Bonhoeffer was awakened at 5 a.m. The war was almost over. American forces were just miles away. Liberation was so close he could almost touch it, but there would be no rescue. Bonhoeffer was led to the execution site along with other conspirators. He was ordered to strip naked, a final humiliation designed to break his spirit. But witnesses later reported that he remained calm, even serene. He knelt for a final prayer. Those who watched said they had never seen anyone pray with such intensity, such complete surrender to God. Then came the noose. Not a quick drop that would break his neck, but a slow strangulation designed to prolong his suffering. The Nazi doctor, who supervised the executions, later wrote, "I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, and then climbed the few steps to the gallows, brave and composed. As the life slowly left his body, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's last earthly act was an act of worship." The doctor continued, "His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." Here's the most heartbreaking part of this story. Bonhoeffer was executed on April 9, 1945. The American Army liberated Flossenburg concentration camp on April 23rd, just 14 days later. 14 days. If he had lived just 2 more weeks, Bonhoeffer would have been free. He would have returned to his fiancée, his family, his ministry. He might have lived for decades more, writing books, preaching sermons, inspiring millions. But perhaps that's missing the point entirely. Bonhoeffer didn't die because he was unlucky. He died because he chose to speak when others remained silent. He chose to act when others stood by. He chose to love when others chose hate. His friend and fellow theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, later wrote, "His death was a victory over the demonic forces that had been unleashed in his nation." The Nazis thought they were silencing a troublesome pastor. Instead, they created a martyr whose voice would echo through history. Bonhoeffer's writings were smuggled out of Germany and published around the world. His books have been translated into dozens of languages. His ideas about cheap grace versus costly grace have influenced millions of Christians. During the civil rights movement in America, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. drew inspiration from Bonhoeffer's example of Christian resistance to evil. When King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, he was following in the footsteps of the German pastor who wrote from his own prison cell. When Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in South Africa, he read Bonhoeffer's letters from prison and found strength to continue his own fight against injustice. When Chinese house church leaders are arrested today, they carry copies of Bonhoeffer's writings with them. His influence extends far beyond Christianity. Bonhoeffer showed the world that faith isn't about personal comfort or private beliefs. True faith demands action against injustice, even when that action costs everything. He wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." These words have become a rallying cry for human rights activists around the globe. Why does Dietrich Bonhoeffer's story matter today? Because the temptations he faced haven't disappeared. They've just changed form. Every generation faces the choice between comfortable silence and costly truth-telling. Every era produces its own versions of cheap grace, the idea that faith should make life easier, not harder. Bonhoeffer warned against a Christianity that promises blessing without sacrifice, forgiveness without repentance, discipleship without the cross. He called this cheap grace and identified it as the deadly enemy of true faith. In our age of social media Christianity, where faith is often reduced to inspirational quotes and prosperity promises, Bonhoeffer's challenge hits hard. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. This doesn't mean all Christians are called to literal martyrdom, but it does mean that following Christ costs something. It means standing up for the marginalized even when it's unpopular. It means speaking truth even when it's dangerous. It means choosing love even when hate seems stronger. Bonhoeffer faced the ultimate test of these principles. He could have fled Germany, lived in safety, and continued his theological work from a distance. Instead, he returned to share the fate of his people. What made Bonhoeffer so dangerous to the Nazi regime? It wasn't just his words or his actions. It was what he represented, the possibility of resistance. Totalitarian systems depend on the compliance of good people. They need ordinary citizens to look the other way, to prioritize personal safety over moral courage. They need religious leaders to bless their actions or at least remain silent. Bonhoeffer shattered this equation. He proved that it was possible to say no to evil, even when that evil seemed unstoppable. He demonstrated that there are some things worth dying for. This is why his execution was scheduled so close to the end of the war. Hitler's regime was collapsing, but the Führer still ordered the killing of the conspirators. It wasn't about preventing future plots. It was about erasing the memory of resistance itself. But they failed. The execution of Dietrich Bonhoeffer didn't silence opposition to tyranny. It created a symbol that would inspire resistance movements for generations to come. His final sermon, preached to fellow prisoners just hours before his execution, was based on Isaiah 53. By his wounds we are healed. Even facing death, Bonhoeffer was still preaching about redemptive suffering, about how good can triumph over evil through sacrifice. Bonhoeffer's most famous book, The Cost of Discipleship, was written years before his imprisonment. But his death became the ultimate illustration of his central thesis. Following Christ is not about receiving blessings, but about sharing in his sufferings. He wrote, "Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life." These weren't just theological abstractions for Bonhoeffer. They were the principles by which he lived and died. When he joined the conspiracy against Hitler, he knew he was likely signing his own death warrant. When he returned to Germany from safety in America, he knew he was walking into danger. When he continued preaching resistance from prison, he knew he was sealing his fate. At each decision point, Bonhoeffer chose the path of costly discipleship over comfortable compromise. This is what made him truly dangerous to evil. Not his intelligence, though he was brilliant, not his eloquence, though he was persuasive, but his willingness to pay the ultimate price for his convictions. Evil systems can handle intellectual opposition, they can manage political resistance, but they cannot withstand moral courage that is willing to die rather than compromise. Why? Didn't God intervene to save Bonhoeffer? This question has puzzled believers for decades. If his cause was just, if his faith was genuine, why wasn't he miraculously delivered like the apostles in the book of Acts? Bonhoeffer himself wrestled with these questions in his prison letters. He wrote about the dark night of the soul, about learning to trust God even when his purposes seemed hidden. Perhaps the answer lies not in what was prevented, but in what was accomplished. Bonhoeffer's martyrdom spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. His death accomplished more than his life alone could have. Sometimes the greatest victory looks like defeat. Sometimes the most powerful testimony comes through suffering. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in thorns. Bonhoeffer understood this paradox. In one of his final letters he wrote, "I believe that God both can and will bring good out of even the worst evil. For that purpose he needs men who make the best use of everything." His death was not meaningless suffering. It was a seed planted in the soil of history, destined to produce a harvest of justice that continues to this day. As we reach the end of this story, we return to that dawn in April 1945. The thin man with glasses walking calmly to his execution. The Nazi officials who thought they were ending a threat. The noose that they believed would silence his voice forever. They were wrong. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's voice has never been stronger. His example continues to challenge comfortable Christianity and inspire costly discipleship. His words still echo in the halls of power when tyrants threaten the innocent. He proved that there is something stronger than death. Truth lived out with complete integrity. He demonstrated that there is something more powerful than evil. Love, willing to sacrifice everything. The Nazis executed his body, but they could not kill his spirit. They silenced his voice, but they could not stop his message. They thought they were writing the final chapter of his story, but they were actually writing the first page of his legacy. Today, when we face our own moments of moral choice, when we must decide between safety and truth, between comfort and courage, the ghost of Dietrich Bonhoeffer whispers, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." His martyrdom reminds us that some things are worth dying for. And paradoxically, when we're willing to die for what matters most, we discover what it truly means to live. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged just days before the liberation of his concentration camp, but his voice never fell silent, and it never will.